A patient presents with an extremely tight neck. The practitioner applies standard manual pressure, targeting the local tissue to release the tension. The moment the cervical tension releases, the stored kinetic load does not simply disappear. Instead, it transfers violently. Instantly, a cascade of severe symptoms strikes the patient. They experience sudden acute pain in the inner elbow, their jaw locks shut, and a deep ache radiates across the opposite shoulder and down into the opposite hip. To a practitioner trained exclusively in segmental anatomy, this widespread reaction appears mysterious. It looks like an entirely new injury or a bizarre medical anomaly completely unrelated to the neck. But viewed through the lens of fascial architecture, there is no mystery here. The reaction is entirely predictable. It is a matter of structural math. The patient has just experienced a full-body spiral collapse. The human body fires in architectural sequences, not isolated segments. When you release a single, highly tensed point in a connected system, you risk detonating the system's entire survival strategy. To understand why this happens, we have to define a compensatory anchor. In a loaded physical system, an anchor is a point of artificial stability that the body creates to manage physical stress it cannot otherwise resolve. Due to its position at the top of the spinal column, the neck is frequently forced into this role. It serves as the final anchor for unresolved structural loads originating deep in the back and pelvis. Looking at this 3D wireframe, you can see how continuous anterior and posterior fascial spirals transmit force across the entire structure. Those glowing lines of tension bypass stable joints and converge heavily at the cervical spine. The neck holds the entire net together. When the manual release is applied, that exact tension point is removed. The system loses its only remaining artificial stability point, and the architectural stack disintegrates. In a compromised system, a tight muscle acts as a structural pillar, preventing total mechanical failure. Compensatory release follows a strict mechanical rule. Removing an anchor forces the stored kinetic load to instantly redistribute to the next weakest link. Following a neck release, that displaced load routes immediately downward, frequently finding its next structural junction at the inner elbow. This diagram highlights why the inner elbow is so vulnerable. It's a major fascial crossroads where the deep and superficial front arm lines converge, along with the anterior spiral and crossbody sling, anchoring the arm to the torso. Without the cervical anchor to hold the top of the chain, the elbow is forced to act as an emergency pressure valve. The joint's structural capacity is rapidly and completely overloaded. As the elbow overloads, the full system cascade begins. The entire anterior-posterior spiral fires at once in a desperate attempt to re-establish stability across the jaw, the opposite shoulder, and the opposite hip. Severe non-local pain is highly predictable when you track the geometry of a spiral net attempting to catch a falling system. If the neck was only a compensatory anchor, we have to look upstream to identify the original, massive load that forced the system to stabilize. We find the root cause in the posture of the modern desk worker, specifically through the physics of static compression applied over long periods. During prolonged sitting, the pelvis tucks posteriorly. This forces the lumbar spine into flexion, which mechanically drags the entire rib cage downward. This cross-section shows the mechanical reality of that slump. As the rib cage drops toward the pelvis, the diaphragm, highlighted in blue, becomes physically trapped in a restricted operating space. Without room to descend fully, oxygen intake drops. The mechanical restriction of the diaphragm also blunts vagal tone, shifting the nervous system into a low-grade threat state. To keep oxygen flowing, the body executes a respiratory substitution. The nervous system recruits the scalings and upper traps in the neck to manually pull the ribs upward for air, an action known as accessory breathing. Chronic neck tension is a respiratory substitute. The neck is tight because it is bearing the continuous mechanical load of collapsed lungs. This respiratory collapse is compounded by a critical environmental variable, constant visual fixation on a digital monitor.
Staring intently at a screen isn't a passive act. It creates the screen siphon, placing a severe, continuous stabilizing demand directly on the nervous system. Look at this profile of a visually locked user. To keep the eyes perfectly steady on a fixed target, the brain initiates a visual vestibular lock, physically freezing the suboccipital triangle at the base of the skull. This ocular fixation arrests cervical mobility entirely. The tension tracks directly from the base of the skull down through the neck, holding the vertebrae rigid. Because the neck is locked, the ribs cannot expand. The respiratory system is now fully trapped in its collapsed state. The upper body's chain reaction. If the eyes don't move, the neck won't move, and the ribs remain frozen. The modern desk environment overrides natural respiratory mechanics through a combination of physical compression from sitting and visual lockdown from the screen. The nervous system responds to this disabled core and visually locked neck with high grip syndrome, a desperate, high-toned state of muscular bracing. This diagram of the deep front line shows the brain's internal stabilization strategy. Tension runs from the compromised neck upward, aggressively clamping the jaw's masseter muscles. The jaw and shoulders effectively turn into rigid, load-bearing pillars, artificially supporting the upper spine's weight. Over thousands of hours at a desk, this intense, protective chronic bracing becomes the permanent baseline state of the worker's body. Jaw clenching and upper trap tension function as load-bearing emergency adaptations, maintaining an upright posture in a collapsing system. This brings us back to the opening clinical paradox, the practitioner massaging the desk worker's tight neck to relieve their pain. This split-screen layout shows the segmental approach on the left. The treatment focuses purely on manipulating the localized point of symptom expression, ignoring the rest of the system. On the right is the architectural approach. We see that releasing the neck triggers the failure of the entire spiral line. The load instantly snaps into the elbow and hip because the anchor was removed without addressing the pressure underneath it. Treating the end of a fascial chain before clearing the root cause at the beginning inevitably forces massive structural load into the body's most vulnerable junctions. Treating pain strictly at the site of the symptom frequently removes the exact architecture that is keeping the patient's system intact. To resolve this structural failure without triggering a spiral collapse, clinical intervention must follow the correct architectural sequence. The process has to begin upstream, targeting the pelvis and the back body spiral first. Manually restoring the geometry of the pelvis naturally untucks the lumbar spine. This creates the necessary space for the rib cage to re-expand and the diaphragm to descend. Once the rib cage expands and oxygen flow is restored, a downstream cascade of healing occurs. The anterior spiral stops overworking, the elbow ceases to act as an emergency pressure valve, and the jaw finally lets go. When the sequence is respected, the body safely lets go of its emergency bracing. The shoulder blades glide down, and the neck organically relaxes. In biological architecture, sequence dictates the outcome. You cannot fix a symptom without first repairing the root load path that made the symptom necessary.